Ever stood under a sky so wide your secrets felt small? Here on the Cowboy LX story, we ride the stories of the West campfire truths, trail dust memories, saloon whispers. Gritty human, sometimes messy. Every tale is a horizon to chase. Subscribe, pull up a stool, and maybe find a little courage for your own frontier. Dawn came the color of tin. The rope on the gallows groaned. Breath smoked out of 30 mouths and hung above the square of Cinder Creek. A red hawk cut a slow circle over the church steeple. Sheriff Ephraim Cutter stood with his hat pushed back and a folded paper pinched between two fingers. He read the charge in a flat voice that carried. Murder of a hand on Mesquite Ridge, assault upon a homestead. He did not look at the man on the trap. Tano Redbird held himself straight. The wind lifted his hair from his face. He turned his head once, searching the crowd. His eyes found Jonah Rourke near the back. Jonah kept his own hat low and one hand inside his coat thumb on a cracked pocket watch he should have left at home. The glass face was spidered, and the hands were stuck at 5:12. He flicked it as if time could be knocked loose. Tano spoke in Apache soft and even meant for no one who would claim to hear. Jonah heard enough. The wheel keeps rolling until someone breaks the axle. The sheriff nodded to the hangman. The trap clapped. The hawk rose. For a while there was only the squeal of hemp and the sound a body makes when it stops being a body and becomes weight. Then the first drops came. The rain smelled like creosote and iron. People ran for the eaves. They left boot tracks like scars. Jonah did not move. He stood and let the rain wet his hat and sting the side of his face where the silver scar traced from temple to jaw. When the deputies cut the rope and lifted the weight from it, only the sheriff and the hangman and Jonah remained in the square. A busted wagon wheel leaned against the jail wall, missing a spoke. The rain beat on it until the wood darkened. "You aiming to drown on your feet, Rourke." Ephraim spat brown juice and watched it mix with the mud. "Just making sure you finished what you started," Jonah said. His voice had the rust of long disuse. "Justice is what I started," the sheriff said. "That savage killed on my people's land. Civilization is coming whether your kind of soft likes it or not." "Which kind is mine, Sheriff?" The sheriff grinned at the scar and went inside. The bell of St. Agnes sent a thin sound across the damp street. Jonah tucked the watch away and walked through the rain to Crowder's General. The lamps in the windows made a buttery square on the wet boards. He pushed in through the door, and the smell of coffee and twine and molasses folded over him. Elias Crowder set down a crate and peered at Jonah under pale brows. "Storm took her time this year. You look like a drowned cat." "Give me flour coffee salt," Jonah said. "Nails, too. The barn door has a mind of its own." Elias moved quiet between barrels and sacks. He kept his voice low when he came back. "Folks say they caught that boy far from Mesquite Ridge, far as in the other side of the ridge line." "Careful, Elias." "I am careful," Elias said, "but I can count. Copper Star men been sniffing around the ridge all season. Cutter puts on a hangin' within a day, no ride for the circuit judge." He set the sack on the counter, then glanced toward the door. "And your watch, Jonah. You're flicking it." Jonah forced his hand flat on the counter. "Habit," he said. He paid and shouldered the sack. Outside, the rain had thinned to a mist that turned dust to paste. Men were already back on the saloon porch, hats, low boots up cards, wet at the corners. On the corner near the hitch rail, a woman stood with a small girl tight to her skirt. The woman's dress was buckskin mended and thin. Her hair was a dark rope with stray strands stuck to her cheek. A fading bruise colored her cheekbone the yellow of old apples. "Please, work for one night," she said to a passing man. "My child is hungry." The man looked away and stepped around them. Another laughed and spat into the street. Jonah found himself moving before he decided to. He stopped in front of them and slipped a cloth-wrapped loaf from his saddlebag. He held it out. The woman did not move. The girl watched the bread with wide, solemn eyes. "Take it," Jonah said. "There is more where that came from." She took it and broke off a small piece and gave it to the girl. The child ate slow at first, then faster cheeks, working eyes on Jonah like he might take it back. Deputy Milo Griggs crossed the boards toward them, hand on his gun belt. "Sheriff says no begging in town." "They are leaving," Jonah said. "With you," Milo's mouth tilted. "Why?" "Because I asked," Jonah said. Boots thudded. Sheriff Ephraim stopped 2 paces off thumbs hooked in leather. "Problem here, Milo." "No problem," Jonah said. "I offered a ride." The sheriff studied the woman, then the girl. Something in his eyes changed like a snake uncoiling. "Know who she is, Rourke. That's Tano Redbird's sister. You made a show of staying for his swing." Jonah kept his face blank. "She has a child who hasn't eaten." "Word is she was part of that business out at Mesquite Ridge," the sheriff said. "Convenient that she shows up today." "Word is a breeze. Today is rain," Jonah said. "The girl is hungry." The sheriff smiled with only one side of his mouth. You haul her out of here, people will talk. They will say a soldier with a scar learned to like Apache blood. Let them talk, Jonah said. He lifted the child up to the wagon seat. The woman climbed after slow and stiff a hand on the girl. Jonah took the reins. The sheriff watched them roll away and did not bother to hide the calculation in his eyes. They left town on the west road. The road ran brown and slick, and the rails along the mesquite shone dark from rain. A canyon wren called out from a rock, cut a high descending trill. The girl held the cloth to her chest and looked back until the painted sign of St. Agnes was a smear. "What is your name?" Jonah asked, eyes on the road. "Ayanna Greywind. This is Mina." Jonah nodded. He touched the team with his voice. "Easy, Juniper." The horse flicked an ear. The woman's gaze slid to Jonah's scar. It ran pale and twisted along his jaw, a riverbank after a flood. "That was made by an Apache knife," she said. "Not an accusation, not gentle either." It was Jonah said. He almost added where and when, but the word stuck. The land around his place opened in low swells and scrub. His cabin sat up against a windbreak of pinyon. Smoke curled thin from the stovepipe. He tied the team and carried the sacks inside. The room was one large square with a bed in a corner, a table, a stove with a black belly shelves with tools and some books that had seen better hands. A broken wagon wheel leaned by the door, a keepsake of a long-ago wreck he had never finished fixing. "You can have the bed," Jonah said. "I will take the chair. There was no need to sell yourself in town." "Men want something for everything," Ayanna said. Flat, not unkind. "Not today," Jonah said. He set beans to simmer and cut a heel from another loaf. The smell of coffee rose sharp and dark. Mina stood near the stove with her doll-bone elbows and watched the pot as if it might betray her. When Jonah filled a tin bowl and set it down, she looked at her mother first. At Ayanna's nod, she climbed onto the chair and ate with careful hands. Her small teeth clicked on the spoon. "You speak Apache," Ayanna said. "Not a question." "Enough to be told when I was in the wrong," Jonah said. "You were a scout," she said. He stirred the beans that did not need stirring. "I was a lot of things." Outside, the sky pressed down heavy and pale. Rain tapped the window and then gave over to wind. It found the gaps in the chinking and made the room breathe. After they ate, Mina fell asleep on the quilt with the doll Jonah had carved years ago and never gave to anyone. Ayanna stood by the window. She did not look at the bed. She looked out at the dark trees and the track back to town. "You kept your eyes open at the hanging," she said. "Most men watch their boots." Jonah did not answer. He pulled the cracked watch and opened the lid and watched the dead hands point. He closed it again and put it away. "Do you know Hollow Mesa?" Ayanna said. Her voice was quiet, not a whisper, a statement almost. Jonah felt the old shape rise in him. Black smoke and the shoulders of men he had once trusted. A woman with a baby pressed to her the edge of a knife catching light. "Stop. Stop." The word too late and the knife faster than anyone could be. "I know it," he said. Ayanna turned from the window. She stepped closer and lifted a hand. Her fingers did not touch his face, but he felt the heat of them near the scar. Her eyes did not flinch. "I was there," she said. Wind rattled the shutters. The wind worried the shutters until the nails in the frame sang. Jonah slid another split log into the stove and shut the door with a dull iron thud. Heat moved in a slow tide across the room. Ayanna stood where she had her hand hovering near his scar, then she lowered it and stepped back. Her eyes were dark and steady. "Hollow Mesa," she said. "You know the ground. You know the smell of it when the fires go out." Jonah looked past her to the little girl asleep on the quilt. The doll lay face up beside Mina, its wooden features calm as if it had never known smoke. He took a breath that tasted of coffee and sap in winter. "I know it. I was a child then," Ayanna said. "I remember a man with a red scarf around his neck and a soft voice. He covered me with his coat when men shouted and horses screamed. I remember a knife. I remember a hand that bled." Jonah felt the old heat in his face as if the scar could blush. He put a kettle on without looking at her. The water hissed. The kettle clicked. Outside, snow began to ride the wind, tapping at the roof with cold fingers. "Stay here for the storm," he said. "The road will go bad." Ayanna nodded once. She wrapped a blanket around Mina, then sat at the table. She did not ask for more. She did not give thanks. Jonah understood that kind of pride. The blizzard took the valley by night. Snow came like sifted flour and then like thrown salt. It found the seams where the chinking had settled and drew thin white lines along the floor. The stove carried the work of the day. The room breathed in heat and let it out slow. They fell into a way of moving that required few words. In the mornings, Jonah pulled on stiff boots and a coat that smelled of horse and smoke and went to the small barn. The sky was a white lid above the yard. Juniper stamped and blew. The old milk cow gave a short, offended bellow when the door opened. Jonah forked hay while his fingers went numb, then burned when feeling returned. On the way back, he stopped at the rain barrel, now a column of ice that held a blue belly at its center, and broke its crust for the bucket he had left beneath the eaves. He carried the cold on his shoulder and felt it bite through the coat to his skin. Inside, Ayanna kept the kettle talking. She boiled water for coffee and for a thin stew that thickened by will more than by ingredients. She patched a tear in Jonah's shirt with stitches so small and even that he could not find where it started. She set the mended cloth down without remark. He took it up the same way. Mina watched him from the edge of the quilt. She did not come close at first. She tracked his movements with grave attention that did not look away when he caught her eyes. When he set a scrap of pine on the table and shaved it with his knife, the sound dry and quick drew her closer. He carved the curve of a neck, the slope of a back legs that were a little too short because the wood was stingy. The room filled with the green smell of fresh-cut pine. "What does that?" Mina asked at last. Her voice was small and cracked from disuse. "A horse," Jonah said. He tapped the window with the handle of the knife. "Like Juniper." Mina's lips moved around the name. She said it as if it were a spell. Juniper. Ayanna glanced over from the stove. She did not smile, but something eased in her shoulders. Jonah sanded the pine with a piece of worn cloth until it felt warm and smooth under his thumb. He set the little horse in Mina's hands. She weighed it as if it were more than wood. "Thank you," she said softly. She said it to her mother first, then to Jonah. That night the wind found a new note and sang it until morning. The stove ticked and lulled and woke them again when the wood fell. Jonah slept in the chair with a blanket over his knees and the weight of his watch warm in his shirt pocket. Sometimes he pulled it out and pressed the lid open and watched the dead hands rest where they had been left. He thought about prying the case off, and he thought about throwing it into the snow until the cold cracked it into a clockwork of glitter. He did neither. He closed it and listened to the small click which was its own kind of heartbeat. On the second day, Ayanna asked him a question without turning from the window. "Why did you stay at the hanging?" "Someone should have kept their eyes open," he said. "It does not bring him back," she said. He did not answer. He stood and tested the latch on the door and checked the window where the putty had dried and pulled away from the wood. A small line of white grew there, thin as flour dust. He packed it with a strip of rag. Mina sat on the floor with the horse. She made it jump the cracks in the plank. When it fell, she picked it up and set it right. Her hair had dried in soft curves around her face. Her cheeks were less hollow. Ayanna brought 2 cups of coffee to the table and took the chair across from Jonah. She smelled faintly of wood smoke and soap. Her hands were nicked the way a person's hands get when they do not own much and cannot afford to buy new things when the old ones break. "You wear guilt like a coat," she said. He kept his eyes on the steam that rose from the cup. "Maybe I do." "Hollow Mesa," she said again, quiet. "You were there." "Yes." "Were you the one with the red scarf?" Jonah saw the scarf in his mind, a scrap that his wife had given him to keep dust out of his throat. He had worn it without thinking. He had tied it around his neck that morning like a man ties a habit. He had pulled it up when the smoke came. He had pulled it down when he shouted, "Stop." He remembered a woman with a child and a knife. He remembered stepping between the knife and the child. He remembered the blade striking bone and sliding along it. He remembered hands that dragged him back and boots that kept him from getting up. "I was the one who failed to stop it," he said. The words were flat. He coughed once, and it sounded like a laugh that had cracked. "I tried." Ayanna reached across the table and touched the edge of his cup. "You bled for someone who was not yours. That is not failure." He looked at her then. The stove gave a quiet pop as the wood shifted. Snow pressed at the window as if it wanted to see into the room. In the late afternoon, the wind relaxed. The air held its breath and then let it out. Jonah pulled on his coat and stepped outside to check the drift along the fence. The snow had piled in soft shoulders up to his thigh. The ridge beyond the pasture had vanished. The world was a bowl of white that rang with silence. He walked the perimeter with a hay fork and felt the cold sit in his bones. When he turned for the door, he saw a shape at the edge of the trees. For a moment he thought it was a stump, then it moved, a rider. The horse tossed its head. The rider did not raise a hand. They watched each other across the field until a gust pulled a curtain of snow between them. When the wind cleared the space again, the rider was gone. He did not mention it inside. He beat his boots against the threshold and set them near the stove. He felt the tingle of blood thawing in his toes. Ayanna looked up from the pot. Her eyes asked a question. He shook his head once, and she nodded like a person who heard what had not been said. The third morning broke with a hard brightness that made the windows ache. The world was clean and punishing. Jonah fed the animals and returned with crystals of ice in his beard. Ayana had porridge warming, and Mina had set the little horse in a position of honor on the corner of the table. She had pulled a few threads from a frayed blanket and braided them into a cord, clumsy but determined. The colors were red and blue, worn thin. "For you," she said, "protection." Jonah crouched and let her tie it around his wrist. The cord tickled in the hair at the edge of his skin. He felt something close in his throat, and was glad she was small and would not name what she saw in his eyes. "Thank you," he said, "I will wear it." Mina nodded solemnly as if she were the maker of vows. Midday brought a knock that was more a test of the door than a request to enter. Jonah opened it to find Elias Crowder hunched against the glare with a scarf iced at the ends. He stamped the snow off and came in grateful for the heat. "You got room for a man with news and cold feet," Elias said. He held a parcel under his arm and a look on his face that was part apology. "Sit," Jonah said. He poured coffee black and bitter. Elias glanced at Ayana and Mina. He bobbed his head to them both as if he had rehearsed that courtesy on the ride over. He set the parcel on the table. The paper had the stamp of Copper Star on a corner, faint, but there. Found this on the floor outside the telegraph counter. Somebody careless. Somebody in a hurry. He tapped the parcel. They have engineers sending notes back and forth about Mesquite Ridge. There is copper up there and they want it. Sheriff is thick with them. Men with shiny boots been at the hotel 2 nights running. Ayana's mouth tightened. Her eyes did not leave Elias. "One more thing," Elias said. He held his hat in both hands now. "Ephraim Cutter has been saying your name a lot, Jonah. He dug up a paper on that old action at Hollow Mesa, the one that never made it to a proper report. He is telling folks you got a soft spot you never lost. He wants that to mean something ugly." Jonah sipped the coffee and let the burn sit on his tongue. Let him talk. "Talk bends men when it lines up with their hunger," Elias said. He swallowed. "I am saying it so you know." Jonah nodded. He slid the parcel back to Elias. "I did not see it." Elias took the hint and tucked the paper away. He looked at Mina, then at the small horse, and a different expression crossed his face. He exhaled like a man who had forgotten he could. He dug in his pocket and set a peppermint on the table. Mina looked to her mother. At Ayana's nod, she took it and held it like a jewel. Elias stood. "The cold is going to set again. I will get out of your hair." When he had gone quiet, settled along the beams. The light outside was bluer now, the kind of blue that made white sting. Ayana ladled more porridge into Mina's bowl. The girl cradled the peppermint in one hand and ate with the other. "There is something I did not say," Ayana said after a time. She did not look at Jonah. She watched the spoon travel and return. "My brother told me a name before they took him to the square. Caleb Cutter. He said that name through blood. He said he saw him shoot a man at Mesquite Ridge during an argument. When Caleb saw Tano on the ridge, he called Apache. The sheriff made it simple after that." Jonah set his cup down. He did not speak for a count of 5. The stove hummed. The cord on his wrist felt warm where it rested against his skin. He could hear the little sounds that a child makes when she is not afraid to move her lips. "That is a heavy thing to carry," he said. "It is heavier to carry alone," Ayana said. She met his eyes now. "I am not asking you to hold it. I am making sure you know what your eyes are open to." Jonah nodded once. He stood and went to the shelf where his journal lay. He touched the spine and did not take it down. He turned back and saw that Mina had climbed to the window and was pressing her nose to the glass. Her breath made a soft oval on the frost. "Horse," she said. Her voice was clear and excited. Jonah crossed the floor in 2 steps and looked past her shoulder. Out by the line of black juniper there was a horse, no rider. The animal stood with its head up and ears sharp as if waiting for a cue. Tracks came from the trees and stopped hard. Jonah felt the skin on his neck tighten. He rested a palm on the table to steady the room. Ayana moved to Mina and lifted her down without a word. The kettle chose that moment to begin its thin whistle. The sound hung in the air like a wire pulled taut. The kettle whistled until Jonah lifted it from the stove and set it on the back ring. He took his coat from the peg and stepped into the bright cold. The air cut the inside of his nose. Snow answered the light with its own hard shine. The horse at the juniper line stood unclaimed, chestnut with a white sock on the near hind, frost on the whiskers. Jonah walked slow, hands open, voice low. "Easy, friend." The animal watched him, then dropped its head to sniff the glove he held out. No saddle. A rough rope hackamore. The rope was wet with melt and smelled faintly of resin. He led it to the corral and looped the rope to a post. In the snow at the edge of the trees, boot tracks went in, not out. He crouched and touched one print. The edges were still sharp. Whoever had watched his place had gone on foot into the dark cover. Inside, Ayana had moved Mina away from the window. Jonah brushed snow from his shoulders and set a hand on the table to steady the heat in his fingers. Ayanna did not ask. He did not offer. The understanding felt like a plank laid over a narrow creek. The day kept its blue. After noon, a bell from St. Agnes rang once across the frozen air. Then a knock came that carried certainty, not a stranger's knuckles. Jonah opened the door to a square of glare. Elias Crowder stood with a man in a city coat that had collected white across the shoulders. The stranger removed a glove and offered a hand. "Nathaniel Whitlock, sir, from Denver. May I enter?" Jonah stepped aside. The man crossed the threshold with care as if the room might shift. He had a thin, wintered face and a mouth that did not know how to be easy. He held a leather case to his chest as if it were a newborn. "Your stove is a blessing," he said. "My circulation does not suit this country." Ayanna stood behind Mina, watchful the way a cat watches a dog near a sleeping kit. Whitlock gave her a brief nod of formal respect. "Mr. Whitlock has business," Elias said. He gave Jonah a look that mixed worry and a kind of brittle hope. "Papers and names that matter." Whitlock set the case on the table and opened it. The smell of old paper lifted into the warm air. He arranged pages in a neat fan, as if order alone could keep danger from the door. "I represent Continental Metals Trust," he said. "We have interest in acquiring mineral rights through proper channels. What we do not tolerate is fraud that poisons a market. My work involves the following of money. Money leaves tracks even when horses do not." He slid one paper forward, banking transfer, amounts that made Jonah blink. "From an account held by Caleb Cutter to one Edward Boyle. Boyle is the same man reported dead the day before the Redbird execution. The name on his new boarding house ledger in Kansas City is Thomas Boyd. The signature, however, is the same hand used on the Mesquite Ridge payroll, which I procured by a small bit of persuasion and 2 drinks for a clerk with a soft heart." He placed another paper beside it, a letter in a rough hand on Copper Star letterhead. "The sheriff writes to Copper Star about Apache presence on hunting ground that overlays a copper-bearing seam. He suggests a solution that would make any claim dispute simpler, and he requests a fee." Jonah read the lines without moving his mouth. Ayanna read with him. Her finger did not touch the page. She let her eyes do the touching. Whitlock took a breath that sounded like it had been held on the ride from Denver. "The circuit judge is due in Las Cruces within a week. If we move our petition before him, jurisdiction can be established for an inquiry into the execution and the land. An affidavit stating what Mr. Redbird told his sister would join the paper. It would be strong." Ayanna's voice was calm, and the calm made it cut. "You want me to say my brother's name in a court run by your people. You want me to give my words to men who made him a rope and a rein." Whitlock's eyes flicked to her, then settled. "I want the truth in a place that writes it down." He looked at Mina. "I have a daughter." He stopped there and let the room tell the rest. Elias cleared his throat. "There is one thing more." He set his hat on the floor and rubbed at the brim. "Last night I closed up the store early. I took a shortcut past the back of the saloon. I heard Caleb Cutter. He was drunk enough to brag and sober enough to mean it. He said he would clean up loose ends before anyone with a badge from outside could arrive. He said Jonah's place by name." The stove popped. Mina started a little, and then put her hand on the wooden horse, as if the pine could keep a promise. The braided cord on Jonah's wrist tickled against his skin. He looked at it, and then at Ayanna. "We leave now," Ayanna said. Her chin lifted, but her voice was not loud. She had a way of making quiet sound like iron. "There is a child," Jonah said. "The storm has not finished. The drifts between here and the road would swallow the wagon north of the cut." He looked down at the pine floor. He felt the floor under his boot, as if it were the only solid thing in the territory. "Running would not empty a single grave," he said. Ayanna held his eyes. He saw his own scar reflected in the black of her gaze, smaller than it was, less a mark than a map. He moved to the corner by the table and slid his hand under the floorboard he had planed thin for this purpose. The plank came up with the soft complaint of dry wood. Cold air puffed from the cavity. He lifted a long rifle wrapped in oiled cloth and a small tin of cartridges. The oil smelled of linseed and old work. Whitlock's hands twitched on his papers. "Mr. Rourke, I am not a fighting man." "Stay low when the time calls for it," Jonah said. "Do not stand in the window. Paper draws lead as fast as blood." He crossed to the back door and opened it on a line of white light. Behind the barn against the earth bank, a low door could be seen where snow had slumped. He shoveled it clear with his arms and boots and tested the latch. The root cellar door opened, and the smell of dirt rose damp as a cave. There was a short tunnel at the back that he had cut years ago to the dry wash. He could fit if he had to. Ayanna and Mina could fit with room to breathe. He closed it again, and brushed snow from his sleeves. When he stepped back into the cabin, the air felt thick from the stove and the people in it and the talk that could not be taken back. Ayanna wrapped Mina's scarf around the child's neck. She spoke in Apache, a murmur that formed a small shelter in the room. Mina nodded, serious. She put the horse in her pocket and patted the bulge to be sure. Jonah set the extra rifle by the door. He checked the main rifle and felt the familiar weight settle in his hands. He did not polish it. He did not bless it. He loaded it clean, one round at a time, the brass shining like coins that could never be spent. He put the pocket watch on the table and opened it with his thumb. The hands still pointed where they had when he first heard a woman shout years ago. He closed it and slid it toward the center of the table. It looked like a small, round stone. Whitlock sorted his papers, then stopped sorting. He folded them once and tucked them into his coat under his arm. His jaw clenched. He breathed with effort as if the air in the room had grown heavy. Ayanna came to Jonah's side. Her shoulder almost touched his arm. He could feel the presence of her without contact. She looked at the corral through the pane of wavy glass. The chestnut horse lifted its head and pawed once at the snow. A canyon wren trilled from the juniper, a bright sound that did not seem to belong to a place where men planned the use of guns. Elias stood near the stove with his hat in his hand. He looked older by the firelight. He turned the hat and did not seem to know it. The first sound came soft, like a big animal walking in a shallow marsh. Then it found its rhythm. Vibration moved up the floorboards and into Jonah's boots. The window glass shivered. Hoofbeats, many approaching from the trees at the edge of the pasture. The chestnut in the corral snorted and turned its rump to the wind. A shadow crossed the sunlit stripe on the floor and took the light from it. The hoofbeats filled the yard until the floorboards under Jonah's boots trembled. He picked up the rifle and stepped out to the porch. Light knifed off the snow. Cold air slid into his lungs and held there like a hard hand. 6 riders came out of the juniper, one behind the other. Caleb Cutter led them. He sat crooked in the saddle jaw, dark with a growth that looked more like neglect than beard. His eyes had the glassy shine that whiskey brings. Deputy Milo rode to his right. 4 others followed, men Jonah knew from the saloon by the way they held their shoulders and by the cut of their hats. "That is far enough," Jonah called. The horses blew steam. Leather creaked as the men shifted. Caleb smiled without warmth. He looked up at the porch as if at a porch he already owned. "You have something that belongs to the county," he said. "The woman and the brat." Jonah kept the rifle down, not low enough to be foolish, not high enough to start something he could not stop. "You came with no paper, no judge. You came with a bottle on your breath." "We came with authority," Caleb said. He tapped the badge on his vest that was not his to wear. "The sheriff sends his regards. He wants what is due." Deputy Milo cleared his throat. He kept his eyes on Jonah's hands. He kept his hand near his gun and did not touch it. "No one goes inside this house," Jonah said. Caleb let out a short laugh. "You shelter an Apache. You insult the law. You think your soldier scar buys you a different rule." Jonah took one step down from the porch and let the crunch of his boot on the crust answer for a heartbeat. He raised his voice so the men behind Caleb could hear. "I know about Edward Boyle. I know about money moving from Caleb Cutter's account to a man who was supposed to be in the ground. I know that copper runs under Mesquite Ridge and that your sheriff writes letters about how to keep Apache feet off it." 2 of the riders looked at each other. The third shifted in his saddle and tugged at his coat. Deputy Milo's mouth opened and closed like a man who had walked into wind he had not counted on. "That is talk," Caleb said. "Anyone can talk." A door creaked behind Jonah. Papers rustled. Nathaniel Whitlock stepped to the threshold and lifted a sheaf high enough for the light. Bank drafts, payroll signatures. A letter with a hand that does not know penmanship but knows the habit of a wrong plan. Your name sits on all of it. Caleb's smile broke. He stared at the pages as if they were a snake that had crawled from a robe. His horse sidled, and he pulled on the reins too hard. "You can ride back into town," Jonah said. "You can tell your brother that other eyes are on this ridge now, or you can pull on a gun and make yourself the last fool in your line." Caleb fired. The first shot punched splinters from the porch post by Jonah's head. Jonah dropped to a knee behind the wash trough. Wood jumped under the strike of more lead. The world narrowed to breath and the line of the rifle sight. Deputy Milo reached for his pistol and found Jonah's round first. It took him in the shoulder and spun him off his horse into the snow. Another man swung his gun up. Jonah shot the horn of his saddle. The horse reared. The man fell, wind knocked clean out of him, hat rolling. Caleb shouted words that did not belong to a man with friends. He slid off his horse and used its body for cover. He emptied his pistol into the trough. Water spat and steamed where bullets found the ice left under the top layer. He reached into his saddlebag and came up with a glass bottle with a rag stuffed into its mouth. Jonah moved left along the porch and drew a breath as steady as the thin air allowed. Caleb struck a match on the saddle and brought it to the rag. The flame bloomed small and hungry. Jonah aimed at the hinge of Caleb's wrist. He remembered the braid on his own wrist and felt it warm under the coat. He breathed out and squeezed. The shot cracked flat across the yard. Caleb screamed and dropped the bottle. It fell short. The flame touched snow and died. A smell of raw spirits rose, and then the sharp, clean smell of cold took it. One of the men behind Caleb kneed his horse back. Another turned his mount and kicked for the trees. Deputy Milo lay in the drift and tried to press a hand to his shoulder. He did not reach for his gun again. "It is over," Jonah called. He stood not tall, but sure enough to be seen. "No one needs to die." Caleb stared at his own hand as if it belonged to someone who had failed him. Blood ran down the palm and dripped black on white. He looked at Whitlock and at the papers held above a heart. He looked at Jonah and saw a man who had not missed. His mouth worked, and then he let breath out through his teeth. He planned it, Caleb said. There was no fight left to dress his words. Sheriff said the Apache were a problem with a simple end. He said if a hand died, he could make it point the right way. The boy saw it. The boy would not stop looking at me from the ridge. Tana Redbird, Ayanna said from the doorway. Her voice did what a bell does. It made the air different. Caleb did not look at her. He spoke as if he could get safe by putting bricks of truth in a row. He said the word Apache, and men ran toward the body. Sheriff moved fast. He talked the preacher into a prayer and the rope into a neck before noon. He said speed keeps a story clean. Whitlock wrote while Caleb spoke. His pen scratched. He did not look up. Elias stood close enough to see and close enough to be counted. He held his hat like an anchor. Horses sounded again at the edge of the trees. Jonah's neck went tight. He turned his head and saw a new line of riders come into the white yard. Sheriff Ephraim Cutter at the front. His coat was clean and his bearing careful. Men rode with him who were not usual badge men. Jonah counted Owen McKendry the blacksmith, Reverend Amos Wyatt from St. Agnes, 2 ranchers who had always paid in cash and counted change twice. "What is this?" Sheriff Cutter said. His voice was measured. He looked like a man in front of a congregation. "My deputy is on the ground. My brother bleeds on my snow. Mr. Rourke stands with a rifle and the wrong company on his porch." Jonah kept the barrel down and set the stock against his thigh. "Your men came to take a woman without warrant. They fired first. Your brother brought fire for the house." He lifted the face that wanted to be stone and met the sheriff's eyes. "We have letters and money trails. We have a living witness in Kansas City with a new name and a nervous hand. We have your brother's mouth open and honest for the first time." Sheriff Cutter did not let his gaze slide. He looked at Ayanna and did not look away. He looked at Whitlock and his papers. He looked at Owen McKendry. He looked at Reverend Wyatt, who sat his horse with the back of a man who knows pews and graves. The sheriff smiled, and there were too many teeth in that smile. "You believe a grief-drunk savage over the law," he said. Ayanna stepped forward. She did not ask permission from anyone to stand where she stood. "I believe what my brother told me with blood in his mouth," she said. "I believe what men write when they think no one sees. I believe your hand on the rope. I watched you have a man hanged while rain fell and the bell at St. Agnes was still wet from last Sunday." Owen moved his horse a pace forward. He was built like a forge, thick and hot in a slow way. He spoke without polish. "Sheriff, that true about money. That true about a man who is meant to be dead." Whitlock held up the bank draft. The seal glinted. "I can speak to the numbers. The man with the new name took money from a Cutter account. He lives in a city and spends from a wallet that knows your mark. The letter speaks to copper. The plan is plain." Sheriff Cutter's jaw tightened. "Caleb," he said. His voice changed. It became the voice of a man in a kitchen. "Did you ride out here to dirty our name?" Caleb held his cut hand to his stomach. His knees went loose. He swayed. His eyes tried to find a place on the snow that looked like an answer. He could not find it. His shoulders sagged. He nodded once, and the nod carried more than any speech he had made in his life. "It was a mistake," he said. "It got out of hand." Sheriff Cutter drew faster than a man should draw in front of a preacher. The shot struck Caleb in the chest and put him on his back. The sound of it cracked against the barn and came back hard. For a breath no one moved. Then men moved all at once. Owen was off his horse and at the sheriff's arm. Reverend Wyatt swung down and grabbed the barrel. 2 ranchers took the sheriff by the shoulders and wrestled him to the snow. The gun thumped free and slid. Elias kicked it under the porch without thinking, and then looked at his foot like it had acted by itself. Blood spread under Caleb in a warm cloud that fought the cold. He gasped. He turned his head and saw the sky. Whitlock knelt with the papers still in his coat. He pressed both hands on the wound and the blood came up between his fingers. He did not know what to do with it and kept pressing. He muttered numbers the way a man says prayers when the right words are not his to say. Sheriff Cutter thrashed and cursed. He looked less like a lawman and more like the men he had always arrested when there was a crowd to please. Owen tied his wrists with a piece of harness leather. The leather went dark where it met the wet of the cuffs. "You shot your own brother," Reverend Wyatt said. He did not shout. He did not raise a hand. He spoke like a man at a graveside. Sheriff Cutter bared his teeth. He bled family for the town. That is what a sheriff is. No, Owen said. The word came out like iron meeting iron. A sheriff keeps the rope off the wrong neck. Ayanna stood very still. Her hands were at her sides and they were open. She looked at Caleb. She did not move toward him. She gave him the same witness she had given her brother. She gave him the only thing a person owes to another person in a moment that is just bigger than a man. She watched. Jonah reloaded by habit. His fingers worked and the brass rang softly as it seated. He did not raise the rifle again. The air was full of breath and the sharp smell of powder. Snow reflected it all back up into faces. Milo tried to sit up. He made a sound like a man rising from a deep chair. He looked at Jonah and then at the sheriff on the ground. He put his good hand up at shoulder height and left it there to show that this was not a day for more guns. "Tie him," Owen said. He nodded at the sheriff. "Take him in. Let the judge find his own words for this." A wagon was fetched from the by-road and brought to the yard. Men lifted Caleb as if lifting would keep him from being heavy. Whitlock climbed in with him, his knees slipping in blood that was already cooling. He kept one hand on the wound and held his case to his chest with the other. He did not look at the case. He did not look at his hand. He looked at the space where a man's eye meets another man's eye and tried to stay in it. They pulled Sheriff Cutter to his feet, leather bit at his wrists. He stared at Jonah as if all the wrong that had been discovered had found itself a face. Jonah did not give him anything in return. The yard settled after the horses moved. Voices dropped. The chestnut in the corral blew. A canyon wren called from the juniper, and the sound was too clean for the tangle on the ground. Elias stood and watched the wagon turn toward the road. He took off his hat. His hair stood in points from sweat frozen in it. Ayanna came to the edge of the porch. Her eyes went over the ruts and the stains and the churned snow. She looked at Jonah, and then at the small square of window where a child's face would be if the child trusted the world. She touched the door frame with 2 fingers as if to feel how strong it was. The bell at St. Agnes rang once, and the sound carried thin and clear across the cold. 4 days after the yard turned to ruts and red stains, the courthouse smelled of wet wool and ink. Frost climbed the windows and ferns. Boots scuffed on boards that needed sanding. A clerk coughed into his sleeve until the judge lifted a hand without looking up. Ayanna stood in a plain dress with a small brass lark at her throat. The bird caught a beam from the high window and held it. She did not fuss with the pin. She kept her hands still. When the prosecutor asked for her name, she spoke it clear. When he asked what her brother said before the rope, she spoke that too. The room shifted when she said Caleb Cutter's name. The sound of pencils on paper went sharp. Nathaniel Whitlock laid out his pages in patient stacks. The bank draft with the Cutter seal caught the light like a coin. The letter on copper star paper spoke with a clumsy hand and a sure plan. A clerk from the land office unrolled a map that smelled of oil and glue and showed a copper seam running under Mesquite Ridge like a dark vein. Deputy Milo Griggs, pale and bound at the shoulder, told the judge he had been sent to fetch a woman and a child with no warrant and a notion. He did not look at the sheriff when he sat back down. Caleb Cutter came in on a stretcher and took the stand on a chair with one leg sawn shorter than the others. He spoke in a hoarse voice that tried not to break. He said there had been an argument with a ranch hand and a gunshot that started without aim. He said he saw Tano Redbird looking down from the ridge. He said his brother called the word that turns men fast and did not stop until the bell and the rope had done their work. He kept his eyes on the floor. His hands shook against the rail. Sheriff Ephraim Cutter listened with a face that knew how to be stone. When it was his turn, he called the papers lies and the witnesses worse. He called the woman at the rail a name that made 3 men in the back row stand until the judge's palm flattened the air. He called Copper a rumor and Money a rumor and his brother a drunk. The judge wrote through it with a small pen and a calm that did not belong to the sheriff's story. The verdict came with the clack of the gavel. life for the sheriff, 20 years for Caleb. Mr. Redbird's name cleared by the same voice that had spoken the sentence on others. In the back, a journalist folded his notes and blew on his fingers as if the words needed cooling before he carried them to the press. Outside the courthouse, the sun sat white and spare above the street. Breath rose in slender ropes. Ayanna stood on the steps and looked at the square as if it were a new town. Jonah stood beside her with Mina's small hand in his, the horse carved from pine peeking from Mina's pocket. Elias waited by the hitch post and found a way to meet Ayanna's eyes without looking past or around her. He lifted his hat and put it back on like a man who has decided what shape his head should be. The bell at St. Agnes rang once. Ayanna closed her eyes and said her brother's name in a tone that needed no answer. Jonah did not speak. He held the watch in his pocket and felt the familiar roundness under his fingers cold and smooth. The thaw began in small places. 2 weeks later, Owen McKendry came up the lane in a wagon full of lumber with Reverend Wyatt on the seat. Behind them trailed 3 families, a coil of hemp, a barrel of nails, and a table strapped with covered dishes that smelled of onion and chicken, and a pie with cinnamon that lifted on the wind. Children hung off the wagon like swallows on a fence. Owen called it a barn raising and did not wait for permission. He handed Jonah a mallet that fit his palm and waved him to the first post hole. Men lifted beams with grunts that turned to laughter when a board slipped and found its place anyway. Women set out food on boards across sawhorses. Mina followed 2 girls from the Doolin place to a patch of dry ground and showed them her small horse. They put it in a line and marched it through dust as if it had business. Ayanna stood with Mrs. Wyatt and argued amiably about where to hang the lanterns in the new structure. Her voice had a lighter top to it like a clear note on a thin glass. At noon, Reverend Wyatt said grace with his sleeves rolled to the elbows and sawdust in his hair. He did not make a speech. He said thank you to a God who allowed bread to rise and children to run and nails to hold. After the plates were stacked again, Mrs. Peterson walked to Ayanna with a folded cloth in her hands. It held a spool of blue thread and a small pair of scissors with the shine worn thin. My mother used these, she said. I have thought about what I kept and why. Her mouth trembled once. Take them if you will. Ayanna accepted by laying a hand on the woman's wrist for a heartbeat and letting it go. By dusk a frame stood that could throw a long, clean shadow. The men stepped back and nodded at what their hands had made. Owen wiped his brow with a square of cotton and pushed Jonah's pocket watch across the table with a thick finger. Fixed your spring, he said. It needed cleaning more than fixing. He did not ask why the watch had stopped. Jonah took it, opened the lid, and heard the small, stubborn tick that he had not heard in years. He shut it and felt the sound travel along the bones of his wrist to the cord Mina had braided. The wind turned wet in the night. Morning came with a soft rain that darkened the yard and woke the resin smell in the cut lumber. A damp line of people wound up Mesquite Ridge that afternoon. They carried a flat stone on a board and a coil of rope. At a clearing where the juniper opened on a view of the town, they set the stone upright and tamped earth around it with their heels. The top was rough. The face was smooth. The carver had cut 2 lines English on one Apache on the other. Tonto Redbird's son brother Hunter cut down by false witness. Ayanna traced the Apache characters with one finger and did not cry. Jonah and Owen dragged a broken wagon wheel from the scrub and hung it on a post with a loop of leather. The rim was split and one spoke missing. Reverend Wyatt spoke 5 sentences and then closed his book. Elias stood with his hat pressed to his ribs. Mina looked up at the wheel, then at the stone, then at Ayanna. She slipped her hand into her mother's and held on. When the rain stopped, the air held the smell of creosote, and the ridge lifted that smell like a flag. A canyon wren sang from a slab of rock, and the sound fell through the hush like clear water. Back at the cabin, a letter waited in an envelope with a seal pressed in green wax. The governor's office asked Ayanna Greywind to sit on a commission concerned with relations between the territory and the tribes whose lands and lives threaded it. The words were formal and careful. The ink smelled new. A few misspellings made the letter human. Ayanna read in the doorway with the last of the afternoon behind her. She looked at Jonah and at Mina. Her hands held still again. She lifted her chin just a little, and the brass lark caught the light and threw it around the room. They stood on the porch that evening while the new frame of the barn spoke in soft, settling sounds. Far off, a herd animal snorted, and the sound came to them across wet earth. Mina leaned against Jonah's leg and tugged his sleeve. I drew us, she said. She held up a sheet of paper with 3 figures: a tall man with a line on his cheek, a woman with long hair, a small child between. She had added a small square house and a tree that leaned. Her pencil had made careful lines and one bold sun. Jonah crouched. "Would you like me to be your father?" The question came out as steady as he could make it. Mina tapped her chest twice. "You are," she said. Ayanna's eyes were dark and bright at once. She did not speak. She set a hand on Jonah's shoulder. It fit there without effort. They went inside as the light went thin. Jonah set the watch on the shelf and listened to its tick find the slow rhythm of the stove. The brass lark glinted once and settled. The little horse stood guard on the table. Outside the canyon, wren finished its evening song, and the smell of wet dust came in under the door and curled along the floor like a small, patient animal. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. If this story resonated with you or made you reflect, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share them in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next story.